one of that rare brand of women who's led a truly full life. She got a good degree at Oxford and became interested in politics and political people. She married Dennis Healey and for a time put private ambition aside to support him and bring up their 3 children. But her own career surfaced later, and her worldwide lecture tours and highly successful ventures into biography have now extended to making films on some of the women behind great men. But Edna Healey is a woman with her own achievements. We met at her home in Sussex. Edna Healey, it's lovely here in East Sussex where you now live, but you were born in the West Country.
Yes, in the Forest of Dean. Marvellous part of the world. It certainly was marvellous when I was a child. With woods of bluebells and butterfly orchids, all sorts of things you never see now. I had a lovely childhood.
Did you appreciate it?
Oh, very much. I mean, it's the thing I remember most. Picking flowers in the spring and wild strawberries and blackberries. Oh, it was wonderful. Lovely way to grow up.
Were there many of you in your family?
Five. And we were a very close family, so that's remained. We're always close even now. I go home quite a lot, and it's still my home. When I talk about home, I mean the Forest of Dean. I'm sorry to say, because this is lovely. But somehow or other, one's childhood home is so different.
Where did you go to school?
A little coeducational grammar school in the Forest of Dean in Coldford. When I went up to Oxford, people talked about coeducational schools as though they were something totally new and exciting. And I mean, for me, it was the only way to be brought up. I didn't know there was any other sort of school.
Did you have great ambitions as a child?
No, not at all. No, I think not. It's difficult to say, looking back, whether you wanted. I think I always wanted to be a talker rather than a writer. I mean, when you look back, the sort of dreams you had was of standing up and making a great speech somewhere. So maybe I did have some ambitions, though I never thought of it until this moment.
That's strange. Oxford came to you after school.
Yes.
What did you read?
English literature and language, and then after that I did a DipEd, an education diploma at Oxford, and then used it to teach.
Was it an exciting time?
Oh yes, because the school I went to was wonderful in many ways, but it had no equipment. I mean, the chemistry lab blew up in my childhood, great excitement. We had no library to speak of, but we had devoted teachers who went off to the great metropolis of Cheltenham or Gloucester, came back with their old battered cars laden with books. And so that I had individual attention that you wouldn't have had in a posher school. We had a lovely set of teachers. So that when I went to Oxford, the great excitement was the Bodleian, to go into the library and have all those books, all the things that I'd not had as a child.
What about the people at Oxford?
Well, there again, it was exciting. I mean, my childhood had been based round the Baptist chapel. That's where my roots were, and all my social life really revolved around the Baptist chapel. And when I went to Oxford, I joined the John Bunyan Society, so I started off continuing my Baptist background, and then gradually moved into politics. So that I had two kinds of backgrounds, in a sense, that I had the religious side and then the political friends, and it was a wonderful time. I had met lots of people were up then who were later to become famous, though one didn't know it then.
Who?
Well, I mean, I remember walking up the High between Tony Crossland and Roy Jenkins. There were all sorts of people there who later become famous, including a young man called Dennis Healey.
You got married and you started having babies, and you became a wife.
I taught first for 7 years, and then, yes.
Becoming a wife and mother was a different stage of your life.
Yes.
How did you cope with that?
Well, I made a garden, I think. You were shut in, and not shut in, but because you're married to an MP, you're very much a one-parent family. And I became keen on gardening because you were in every night. And I don't know, you see your life looking back in stages. And someone said to me at that time, think of life in stages, and you'll get through. And you thought, well, I'll give them so many years of my life. I didn't think what I would do afterwards, but I knew that this was the patch when you washed the nappies and, you know, were up at night with children cutting teeth and so on.
Was it hard?
It wasn't hard so much as boring, you know. The awful time when you felt that you become, your brain had turned to mushy peas, you know, you really resented that. I think that's what one does resent.
That moment when you stopped being a teacher, stopped being a person?
Yes, when you realize that, and this is what seems to me to be so true, that when you're a wife and a mother, and only that, you become invisible. People don't see you as you are yourself. Your children don't. Your good old mum at the sink, you know, or at the cooker. And even your husband stops seeing you. And then later on, when you actually do something, the surprise is astonishing. Good old mum, they say. We didn't know you could do things like that. So that's the period when you almost begin to wonder if you're there still.
Would you have gone into politics, do you think?
I probably would have earlier on. I would like, but there was only one seat that I would ever have wanted, and that was my Forest of Dean. And I might have done, if I hadn't married, I might have tried for that earlier on.
But if you had the chance now, if you started again
now? Oh, not now. One in the family's enough.
No, but I mean, if you were young and getting married now.
Yes, would I now? I tell you what, I think it's very difficult. And I mean, the depressing thing is, do you realize that there are fewer women in Parliament now than there have been for years? It gets worse, not better. So I do think it's very difficult for a woman MP, because she's, if she tries, as some of them have done, to bring their babies to Parliament to feed it, it's jolly difficult.
It's a retrograde step, really, then.
It is, it is. If they would only have sensible hours, it might be easier.
Well, that was difficult for you as a wife of an MP as
yes,
well, presumably.
Yes.
At what stage did you realize that your husband was actually going to forge ahead and become very important?
Really, I suppose not until we got into power, when he became Minister of Defence. Then you realize that this is a new can of worms, in fact, but certainly a new chapter in your life, that this was something quite different. And from then onwards, you realize that from now on, his work would always have to come first. Up till then, you had a feeling that, well, you know, I might be able to do something. But then you realize that always now, everything that he was doing would be more important than anything that I could do.
That must be very difficult to come to terms with.
I tell you how I came to terms with it, by doing something for myself, and late in life, as it were, writing a book. And it worked, it happened to work. So I felt, well, this is something that I've done that's nothing to do with him, absolutely nothing to do with him. And that was a sort of consolation, in a sense.
There were very few women around in politics at that time anyway. Did you find that people tended to dismiss you?
Yes. That's something that still goes on. Yes, it does. It's surprising, but you find yourself very, very often quite invisible. Again, I use the word. We were laughing about it, a group of us wives, the other day, that quite often people will walk past you, talk to your husband, and it is as though you don't exist. You get used to it in time, you know, but it's a thing that, it makes you laugh rather than anything else now, but it still happens.
In the early 50s, you were a young mother, you had a small family growing up. You were also the wife of a politician who was making a name for himself. Without asking you the question about the woman behind the man, how much were you involved in that very important time in political history? Well,
frankly, I took as much part as I could in constituency affairs. I went to Leeds as often as I could, but it was difficult when the children were young. And then I was also chairman of schools and that sort of thing, so I did other things. But I didn't really take much part in his political life, except being there and being supportive, which seemed to me the sensible thing when, in any case, I was held at home.
What's it like watching somebody you know very well getting up and making a speech?
It's agonizing. It's much worse than making it yourself. See, if you're speaking yourself, you will work up all sorts of energy and the adrenaline flows and you work it off. But if you're sitting in the gallery and your old man's down below and people are shouting and the sound comes in great waves and his voice rises above it and then he's drowned, and you're up in the gallery like this all the time, and at the end of it, you ache all over. I remember Mrs. Lyndon Johnson writing, I think, in one of her books, Lyndon has just made his State of the Nation speech. Why am I tired? And it's exactly that.
You've had some marvellous American trips, haven't you?
Well, that was great fun. I went from New York to Santa Fe, a month's lecturing, and then I lectured in Dartmouth too. But that's interesting because America, you know intellectually that America's a cosmopolitan country. It's not when you sit down and you realize that your audience all has Spanish names or that they have German names, and you realize that it is a hodgepodge of nations, and that everything you say has to be geared to someone whose ancestors came originally perhaps from Russia or Central Europe. And so it's an extra dimension.
Do you have set speeches that you give?
I rather tend to have umbrella titles so that they are set in the sense that the form is set. It's as though it's a trunk of a tree, and the trunk may remain the same, but whether it's flowers or fruit or leaves depends on my mood. Sometimes it's a wintry mood and there's nothing of just bare branches, but that's how I see a speech.
Do you ever have to change the title? Use the same
they
speech?
change it for me quite often. I've had some odd titles sometimes. I remember once when I was supposed to be talking about new towns, and they asked me to jazz a title up because Americans like jazzy titles, they said. So I said, well, call it New Wine in Old Bottles. And the second of my speeches was on the changing role of women. And when I got to America and opened my big folder to see what they were expecting, I discovered that I was expected to speak to the New York English-Speaking Union the next day to a title, New Wives in Old Bottles. And it made an extraordinary title. It was quite good, actually, in the end. I don't know.
Did you do it?
Yes. Well, it was down on the program, so all across America, my chairman would say, Mrs. Healey, this is an extraordinary title. And, you know, one did the best with it.
You grew to love it.
I did. It was the beginning of my speech. Each time was made for me.
Very soon after you stopped speaking, or you were continuing to speak, you decided to start writing. That's a different discipline.
Yes, that's totally different. In fact, I began to feel that I was getting a bit glib. You know, you can slur the figures, but if they're down in cold black and white, you've got to be right. And not only that, I really wanted to test myself, and I had a subject that obsessed me the more I thought about it, and it seemed extraordinary that nobody had written the life of this remarkable woman. And it wasn't that I saw myself as an author. It's just that I had insatiable curiosity about this woman, and finally I decided that here was a book that had to be written, and that for some reason I had to write it.
Angela Burdett Coutts.
Lady Unknown, I called it, yes.
Yes. Amazing woman.
Yes, oh, quite extraordinary that nobody remembered her.
And it almost led you into exploring lots of other women.
Oh, yes. And not only that, because she was the center of the 19th century, I mean, she knew everybody in every discipline. It meant that I got terribly interested in all sorts of people, the early scientists, the religion in the 19th century. I got into great trouble about Bishop Colenso. He's like my King Charles's head. Every book I write, I want to bring in Bishop Colenso. One of these days, I shall write 4 volumes, which nobody will read, on Bishop Colenso. But because she was such a key figure in the period, it meant that there was almost no branch of Victorian life that you didn't get involved in.
Do you find it difficult to write?
Yes. I find it difficult to get down to it. I love researching, and I do spend days and days and days buried in archives, and nothing gives me greater pleasure. But that blank sheet of paper, first thing in the morning, I find difficult. Once I'm started, I'm all right, but it is hard to start.
And you've remained, both of you, solidly in the Labour Party,
Yes.
a Labour Party that's changing.
Yes.
How do you feel?
That has always been changing. You know, ever since I remember, there have always been changes and arguments and rows. It's nothing new.
It's pretty drastic at the moment, the change.
Yes, but when you think back, I mean, I always remember, was it Ernie Bevan? Yes, Ernie Bevan said of, someone else said to Ernie Bevan, that man is his own worst enemy. I think it was Herbert Morrison. And Ernie, the marvellous old Ernie, said, not while I'm alive, he ain't. And that's the sort of animosity that there was in those days, too. And indeed, it runs through politics in all parties. People feel passionately about politics, and so they feel passionately if people disagree with them. It's a pity. I don't like the animosities at all.
Will you stay in the Labour Party?
Yes, as long as the Labour Party remains savable as it is. But if it became entirely powered by hate, then I should leave it. But it's not. I mean, the difference between people who are powered by anger, justifiable anger, that's all right. But it's when people are powered by hate that I find that impossible. And if that ever became dominant, then I would find it very difficult. I wouldn't, I would go on inside it, I think, but that would be very difficult to take indeed, because I think it will destroy them. Not only will it destroy the Labour Party, but it would destroy the people who hate. It's corrosive. And that's what I dislike. Not the passion and anger which goes with politics, that's different.
Would you be able to make a separate decision from your husband?
No, I wouldn't. I would not, because our marriage would always be much more important to me than a political party, and therefore I would not make a different decision from his. And if the women's liberation throw brickbats at me for that, they may well do so, but it's true. I would consider that it was much too difficult and much too destroying to follow a different road.
How does your own life change when you're the wife of a minister?
As wife of the Minister of Defence, I remember so well going to a longhouse in Borneo. It meant 2 hours up the rapids on a hollowed-out log until we got to a longhouse where we were greeted by the chief and his daughters. Beautifully dressed. I was in horrible jungle rig, and they were dressed in lovely sarongs, and they did a lovely dance of welcome. And we suddenly realized that we too were expected to dance in return. And so I did a sort of dance in which I meant to say to them, I'm glad we're here, thank you for your welcome. And you didn't feel quite as much of a Charlie as you might have done. And I suppose it must have worked, because as we were going, the chief called his henchman, pointed to the rafters, and from the rafters let down a basket, and out of the basket took a human head and handed it to me with a magnificent gesture. And my interpreter, standing at my elbow, said, for God's sake, look pleased. They never do this. It's a great honor. So I suddenly remembered the Foreign Office ruling that you have to give something equal in value for everything you're given. And I couldn't think what you give in return for a human head. So I gave my watch. I think that was the only thing I could think of. But I took my head home with me and...
Put it in the dustbin?
No, indeed. I kept it for some while in a box, waiting to think what does one do with a human head. And I put it behind the settee in Admiralty House until one day some men who were painting the room came into the kitchen with ashen faces and said, "Do you know what Mrs. Healey keeps behind her settee?" I think they looked at us with new respect after that so perish all the enemies of Healey.
Have you still got it?
Well, we gave it to, I think my husband sent it over, I sent it over actually, to the Ministry of Defence with a little note saying, I thought 2 heads would be better than 1 over there.
Mr. Healey, thank you very much indeed for rushing all the way down from London. How much of your success, do you think, is due to your wife?
Oh, a very great deal. In fact, I can't imagine it without Edna. Because if you don't have a really solid human family base, I think politics becomes dead sea fruit, and you allow things to worry you far too much.
Did you ever feel you were stifling her ambition?
I'm not quite sure about that. I think sometimes, I think the real problem was that when the children were at school, say between 5 and 18, I had far too little time with them. Edna had to carry the whole burden. And as you know, she's got lots of interests outside the family, and I think probably she had too much to do at that time, but she's made up for it since. She neglects me now.
You don't?
I left him for 3 weeks during the worst summer we've had for a long time.
The last summer?
Yes.
Was that tough?
As a matter of fact, it wasn't. I'd be rather upset if I say that, but I was,
I know what you mean.
I was terribly busy at the time. The house was sitting, so I only had to make myself breakfast, which I'm brilliant at making. And I regretted she wasn't able to come to the royal wedding. That was the only bad thing about it.
Have you ever heard Edna talk publicly?
No, she doesn't like me doing that. In fact, she's dissuaded me very much from going to her talks and lectures, and I'd very much like to do that, but if I ever do, I shall have to hide with a false moustache at the back and never tell her afterwards that I was there. But I have, of course, heard her on the radio and television. I think that on radio and telly, she's still a tendency to be a little artificial, especially if it's, say, a panel game or something like that, where it's difficult, if you're not experienced, to be natural.
Are you coaching her?
No, I would never dare to do that.
He just tells me gently.
Edna has told me how she feels when you're speaking. Are you aware of her when you're speaking?
No, you aren't really. I mean, if you're speaking in Parliament, for example, you're thinking entirely about the other side and your own people, and you can't really think about who's up in the gallery. Party conference, much the same. You really have to think about the audience you're trying to influence. But of course, if you make a muck of it, you're deeply conscious of the fact that Edna was there, and you're conscious of it really when you get home rather than during the speech itself.
It's been a highly successful marriage. Do you ever wish you'd had more time together?
Oh, yes. Wish that now. I wish it all the time, actually. But, you know...
It's been so successful if we'd been together even more.
I think there is that. On the other hand, I think as you get older and the children have left home, you know, you have a lot of interests in common outside politics which you'd like to pursue, and we don't really have enough time to do that.
What about Sussex? You've made your home now in Sussex.
Yes, well, we absolutely love this place, and we bought it really so it had somewhere to put some of my books. The others are upstairs in my study and in the loft. But again, one would like to spend more time here. But someday, when I retire in 40, 50 years' time, then I can look forward to another 30, 40 years of enjoying myself with Edna down here.
But
we're both long-living parents, so I expect we shall live a long time.
When I look at the books and when I see him coming home with yet another carton of books, I wish he'd taken up stamp collecting, except that whenever I've been doing research, I found the library immensely helpful. There's always some extraordinary 19th century book that he's found, which has turned out to be really useful.
But I do often now sneak in through the back way and leave the books in a box behind the door until Edna's left the kitchen so that I can sneak upstairs with them.
Do you think you'll ever retire together?
Well, I don't think either of us will ever retire totally, because, you know, we're very interested in public life, and we've got many interests which, you know, absorb your personalities, so that I think that the idea of sitting like Darby and Joan and looking into the fire, I'd like to do that half an hour a week, but, you know...
You can retire.
Not 24 hours a day.
I've got far too much ahead of me to do.
Well, that's it. But I think what one does look forward to is not being completely the slave of political life, as one is when one's an active politician, and being able to enjoy one's other interests together.
And having some time to walk on these lovely downs together.
Yes. and make more of the garden.